Hey there, and welcome to the Catching Up with Casey show, where we talk about anything and everything that has to do with building cohesive, vision-driven teams. I am Casey Watts, school impact strategist and the host of this show. Now, if you are here, then you inevitably are an instructional leader who wants to make change happen, even when change seems impossible. And you can do that if you have cohesive, vision-driven teams that have done clarity work. They know exactly where they're headed and how they're going to get there. These teams have done identity work, and they've built their self and social awareness skills. And they have done collaboration work, and they know how to move beyond faux collaboration to get to true collaboration where change happens and where people get on board. I'm so excited to bring to you conversations that help you to do exactly that. The work that needs to be done to build cohesive, vision-driven teams. Now, with all of that said, let's dive into today's conversation. Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to tonight's episode. I'm really pumped about tonight's episode because I am joined by Eric Bransteter, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, right?
You are, yes. Yep.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, in a moment, he's going to be introducing himself, but I want to tell you that tonight's episode is all about how to help staff feel heard, supported, and valued, which is all a part of building cohesive, vision-driven teams. And we know that that's what this show is all about. So, Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, and your aspirations in the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks so much, Casey. It's great to be joined with you tonight. It's interesting. I'm a podcast host. I have a podcast for education. I'm normally on the other side.
Yeah.
So I'm over here on the receiving side, so to speak. But it's great to be with you tonight. I'm actually a former educator myself. I was a fifth grade teacher for 5 years. I spent a year as a media specialist. I loved technology in the classroom, everything ed tech. One day, my principal came to me as a teacher and said, "Hey, Eric, I have an interesting idea for you. You love technology. Why don't you be our media specialist?" And I turned him down right away. I said, "I have no interest in being a librarian. That's not for me. I love teaching." And he said, "Well, I have kind of a different vision for you." So basically what I did a lot of technology integration in the classroom. I helped to lead staff within my building and talk about best practices and do research and a lot of one-on-ones. And I realized that during that time, of course, I love working with kids. I also love working with adults. And that's not something that I had done so much as a teacher. So I spent 1 year as a media specialist, and then I became an administrator after that. Spent 4 years as both an assistant principal and a principal. And part of what I've always done growing up, I've always been what I call now a builder. I've always liked to build things. I played guitar in a band for a number of years. We were sponsored. We had a record label. I always gave guitar lessons. I had a couple of jobs. I always just liked to do things on my own. I was a DIY person, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So part of that technology integration was I saw a need for an ed tech platform. Again, being a builder, I said, well, I can go start a company. That's this ed tech company that I wanted to build. And I was young and naive, and I said, let's go with it. So I started a software company. Still to this day, I can't code. I don't know anything about software development, but I started a software company. I don't know how or why my wife agreed to let me do that. She probably thought it was a fad, like, let's go let Eric be himself for a little bit.
Yeah.
But I spent 4 years, all 4 years as an administrator, also building my own company, my own ed tech company. And it got to a point where I felt like I wasn't doing anything well anymore. I wasn't a good administrator. I had 2 kids at that point. I wasn't a good husband. So I decided to leave education and do my own ed tech company. Did that for about 3 years, ended up selling that company, worked for the acquiring company for quite a while, about 3 years. And we were in the teacher retention space mostly. And I was having all of these fantastic conversations with school leaders across the US. And I decided, why don't I record those conversations and then share them out with the world, which is where my podcast, the Employee Experience in Education podcast, came from. It came from me selling to schools, essentially school culture software, teacher retention software, and then recording those conversations. Right now, I'm actually the VP of school partnerships for a company called Math Track. We are a math teacher training licensure company. So we work with schools to help them license their paraprofessionals. We're an institution of higher ed, so we have a bachelor's program that's apprenticeship based, and really working with and understanding what does it take to be an effective math teacher. So we're a transition to teaching company, a bachelor company, and focus just on math.
Wow. So I have so many questions, and I feel like actually this is kind of crazy because as you're talking, I'm like, man, we have so many things in common. And guys, just so you know, this is the first time that we've actually interacted and have had a conversation. But so it sounds like you've kind of gone a little bit full circle, right? Like you've experienced all of the different things. But as you were talking, I want to ask you very specifically about your podcast and the employee experience. But it sounds like you were tapped on the shoulder by admin to kind of seek out this new role because of the things that you were already intuitively interested in your role as an educator, and that blossomed into all kinds of different things. So I have a unique question. Have you ever heard of the working genius?
Yes, of course.
Do you know what your working geniuses are?
I do not. So I know about that. I've never done it before.
You totally should, because as you were talking about being a builder and being really innovative, I was like, oh my gosh, you totally, and I'm just kind of like making some assumptions here, but I guarantee you would definitely have the genius of invention, and you probably have the genius of wonder. Maybe I could see that, or maybe even galvanizing, but
Sure.
that's really interesting because those are my two working geniuses as well.
Yeah.
So tell me about when you talk about this podcast and it being all about the employee experience. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So what happens a lot, and I saw it myself as both an educator and an administrator, and of course, as I was selling into schools with my previous ed tech company, there are so many conversations, and rightfully so, Casey, about the student experience. What's it like for our students? We talk about behavior management and making sure that the kids are connected with each other. What we didn't hear about was the teacher experience, the
Mhm.
paraprofessional experience, the principal, the superintendent experience. In the business world, employee engagement's been brought up for years, 15, 20 years now, talking about employee engagement. And I'm glad the business world has gone beyond engagement, because engagement, you can kind of sell engagement. You could get, it doesn't happen in schools. In businesses, you could have a pinball machine. You could have, there's beer on tap to help make our people engaged.
Yeah.
Doesn't look quite the same in education. But to me, that was more of a fad. That was more of a, can I get buy-in from my staff to be happy for a short amount of time? When we stepped back and said, engagement's clearly not working in business, it's clearly not working in education. We're talking about the student experience all the time. What's left? What are we missing? And there was an aha moment for us internally. What about the staff? Are we
Yeah.
taking care of the staff, or our staff, your teachers, your counselors, your paraprofessionals, are they just seen as a lever to improve student scores? Do you have the right staff on board? How do you know? How do you make sure that people want to come to school on a Monday and they leave on a Friday energized for the next week? And so many conversations again, and I get it. We track student engagement, we track student scores, everything student, student, student.
Yeah.
Well, research shows, what's the number one impact on students? It's
The
the teacher,
teacher.
right?
Yeah.
And if you
Mhm.
have teachers that are happy, and I know happy is kind of a soft word, but if you have teachers that are happy in their classrooms, you're going to have positive student results. So we really sat down and said, based on conversations with school leaders across the US, what does the employee experience look like in education? Can we focus on the educators a little bit? Of course,
Yeah.
again, everything that we do with educators then fall through to the students, but let's not think about teachers as the cogs in the wheel. Let's think about them as, if we focus on them for a little bit, what ends up happening?
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that idea. And I think too, if we are thinking about our schools as being a place that teachers want to belong, as a place that they're working on something that's bigger than themselves. They're working towards something that's bigger than themselves. That's going to create the buy-in, the engagement that we desire, that we're seeking.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about what you find most causes educator burnout or decreased retention.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, my first several conversations I was very intentional about finding educators that left the profession first. It did a couple of things. One, it grounded me in the narrative and kind of that qualitative piece of this. And then two, it gave an avenue to really dig into people's stories. Obviously, if I talk to somebody, a former teacher, just out of the blue, they're not going to share a lot of information, kind of that superficial, well, I wasn't happy, I found something else. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, there's going to be more to it than that. So I sat down with three former educators. I think in the first 10 episodes, three of them were former educators. And I was shocked both in a wow, that's surprising, but also in a hey, wait a minute, we're really missing something kind of a way. And what I kept hearing over and over is that people just weren't listening to them. By
Mm-hmm.
people, I mean primarily the principals, the school leaders. I'm a former administrator. I know how busy that role is. But I also understand, I think there were 86 adults or so in the building where I was. That's a lot of people. There were two administrators. How can I possibly take care of? We had an elementary school, about 720 students, 86 adults. How can you possibly do all of that? And as I was thinking and hearing the narratives that I kept hearing from these three educators that left, I was thinking about what I did as an administrator. And I always had on my desk my to do list because obviously things have to get done. And
Right.
as I reflected back on that to do list, I didn't have things like have a one on one with Casey. I didn't have a thing like I'm going to pop into Mr. Smith's room just to check and see how he's doing. I had all this stuff on that list that I had to do. And one story in particular comes out. This was one of my first guests. She was the former special education teacher of the year in my home state of Indiana. She was probably 3 or 4 years ago. After that year that she received that award, she quit education completely. And I
Hmm.
said, Emily's her name. I said, Emily, how was it you went from teacher of the year to leaving education? She said, well, I kind of noticed, and I'm paraphrasing, I noticed internally that I was getting more and more upset. And I was getting, I would go home and I'd cry. And she said I would cry at the end of every day coming home. And it got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. And I said, Emily, did you ever talk to your principal about this? No, I didn't. I was just trying to do the best that I could as a teacher. I got a classroom, I close my doors, I teach, I end up leaving.
Yeah.
And I said, Emily, if your principal, special ed director, whomever, if they came up to you and said, hey, Emily, how are you doing? How honest would you have been? And she said, I would have broken down in tears and said everything. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't keep that kind of stuff in when somebody asks me, but nobody ever said, Emily, how are you doing? Nobody ever said,
Yeah.
hey, Emily, what do you need? And again, I totally understand because far too often, I should say, I was also that principal. I was the person that had that to-do list. I was the principal going through the motions. I had my own two young kids at home. I
Mm-hmm.
was running a company on the side as well, but like I didn't devote enough time to the people in my building. And Emily wasn't the only one that said, I wish people would just listen to me. That comes up all the time in these educators that have left. They simply want to have somebody that cares for them. They want to know that somebody in the building cares for them, cares about them, wants to make sure that they have everything they need to be successful. So that again, that keeps coming up in conversations, even to this day. So that's where the heard part of this comes from. I talk a lot about how teachers want to feel heard, supported, and valued. Heard means they have an avenue, they have a voice, and somebody is willing to ask. And I think that's critical. We have to ask for people to talk. We have to ask for people to share their sentiments. Um, could be a survey. It could be a one-on-one conversation. It could be I pop in after school, and just make sure people are okay. But people need to be able to share themselves at work. So obviously you have to have trust in there. Trust is going to be critical important. I also believe trust is built when you ask people questions like, hey, Casey, how are you doing today? And if something is shared, then I'm not the person that shares that with anybody else. This is a one-on-one private conversation.
Mhm.
So the heard part of this is just critical to me. And when I've been a guest on one other podcast, and I was reinforcing the same thing. It's, how do we make sure that people have a voice? And it
Yeah.
sounds really basic. It sounds really simple. A lot of schools will do things like surveys. And the question is, of course, what do you do with that information? And
Mhm.
oftentimes, I did the survey, check. That's one thing off of my to-do list. Now I can go do the rest of my to-do list. It's like, hold
Right.
on, slow down. Let's collect people's information. And then you actually have to do something with that.
Yeah. So oftentimes I think about like the things that we know we need to do as leaders, or that leaders know that they need to do and implement in their schools. And it sounds so basic, but when you really start peeling the layers back, it's actually very complex. And what you've said about listening and having a staff who feels heard, that's a really actually complex thing to do, because you have to consider the act of listening and then the follow through of it. Like you said, with the
Mhm.
survey, I can send surveys out all day long, but if I'm not doing anything with it, then it becomes a moot point.
Yep.
Um, I want to talk about this. I heard you say something about these. You talked about visiting with people, teachers who left the profession, and I just for a split second want to address that again. I almost envisioned like this flow chart where you have teachers who are leaving the profession, and that's it. That's the end
Mhm.
for them. Or you have teachers who are leaving a campus. Would you say that they're leaving a campus and or the profession for the same reasons, typically, if it comes down to being heard?
Not necessarily. So couple of things that I think about there. We had a teacher, phenomenal teacher, very happy, at least said she was happy and appeared to be happy. Her kids went to a school that was not in the same district where she was teaching. That's an obvious situation where the logistics of life just make way more sense when she's on the same schedule as her kids.
Right. Yeah.
I can also think of a couple of examples where a teacher left the building thinking that he or she was escaping a leader, going to a different leader, a different principal in this case. And that sometimes went well, oftentimes has not gone well. So I think there's a lot of reasons that people end up leaving. Now, and even thinking about salary, and of course salary is an important part of the
Right.
employee experience. You have to make sure that you meet a minimum level, minimum threshold, if you will. So sometimes leaving districts, going to a different district, is a financial decision, which makes a lot of sense depending on families and situations that you have at home. I guess I would warn people, if and sometimes leaders just are not very good leaders, and
Right.
sometimes that escape is 100% needed. I would probably recommend to people that they internalize that a little bit and try to write down as much about the situation as they can.
Yeah.
So I go to work, I don't enjoy work. Why is that? Is it the leader? If you can say yes to that, write down some reasons why. Here are some things that I'm noticing. Here's some things that I'm not noticing. And then think through, if I were to change my environment, my context, how much of that do I feel like is changeable?
Right.
Because there is not as much as people think. One of the one of the things I hear a lot is, "Okay, Eric, you're an entrepreneur. You left education, started your own company. How awesome is that?" Well, there was a lot of time when it wasn't awesome,
Hmm.
and the consistency of education is one of the very unique things about having a job like a teacher, having a job like a counselor. You know what your work schedule is, you know what your hours are, you know what your paycheck is going to be. That's on an ongoing basis. When you leave and start your own thing, or maybe go to the business world, it's not always like that. There were many times where I would pay my employees and then pull from my own savings account because I couldn't pay myself. That's just part of the journey.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just caution, the grass isn't always greener. There's probably some things that you could work through internally. I think part of the employee experience is, even if there's a leader that you don't necessarily like, don't necessarily trust, have you had a true conversation with that person? Or are you just assuming it's going to be better if you go somewhere else?
Right.
Oftentimes, people are hesitant to have tough conversations, and it takes some bravery, it takes some courage, and it takes a, "Hey, Casey, can I have 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes of your time? I'm struggling here. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. I'd love to just share how I'm doing and see if there's anything you could do to help me."
Yeah.
As a leader, I would have loved for a teacher to say that. I also understand not everybody's in that context, in that environment where they feel comfortable to do so.
Right. That's really hard. But I do think it's important. Like, that's one way that a leader can take a step back and be really reflective and think, what am I noticing about the turnover rate here? What am I noticing about retention rates? Are there any patterns or consistencies? And if there are certain patterns and consistencies, what can I shift as a leader to ensure that my staff is feeling heard? So, talk to us a little bit about how we can really help our staff to feel supported and valued.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with valued. One of the things, so the two things that came up the most are, one, feeling heard. I feel like I don't have a voice. And then I don't feel appreciated for the work that I do. That comes up over and over again. So, for school leaders that are listening, one thing that I have tried in my own career post education to do is at least once a week, just be very intentional about telling somebody genuinely what you appreciate about them. I had a guest, Zach Mercurio, on the podcast recently. He said something that I think is going to be etched in my brain. He said it's just 5 words, and I might not say it quite like he did. Maybe it's 4 or 5, depending on how I say it. But if it wasn't for you, dot dot dot, and then think about, how do you finish that sentence? And that is so powerful.
Yeah.
Imagine a school leader going to a kindergarten teacher or an AP physics teacher and saying, if it wasn't for you, our students wouldn't have the same experience that they're having right now. If it wasn't for you, our students wouldn't get dual enrollment credits. It doesn't take very much time at all. And starting
Yeah.
with, if it wasn't for you, means you are singularly focused on the one individual that you're talking to right now, which means after that, whatever you're going to say is going to be specific for them. That
Yeah.
is a game changing thought. And it takes 7 seconds to do that. If it wasn't for you, I'm going to finish my sentence. You don't have to elaborate. You don't have to just reinforce it over and over. You can say that one simple sentence, walk out of the classroom, and I can almost guarantee, as long as there's trust, that teacher starts floating off the air. Because, like, wow, you took time. I know you have 85 other staff members. You took time to talk to me and say I'm unique and special and gave me one individual thing. Again, if I'm a principal, I'm looking at my to-do list. I don't have anywhere on my to-do list if it wasn't for you.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest thing, is appreciation, celebrating one another, having it be genuine, not thinking about it like it's something on your to-do list. And honestly, it could be on your to-do list. Just don't approach it as a to-do. Approach it as a, I just want to let you know how awesome you are. I
Yeah.
really appreciate when you. If it wasn't for you, dot dot dot. So that's the valued part.
Yeah. So, Eric, when I was in the classroom, I actually taught fifth grade as well, but I
Mm.
taught primarily first through fifth grades in my teaching career. And we really worked. One thing we did as a campus was we really worked on using reinforcing, reminding, and redirecting language. And every time my supervisor came in and did evaluations, one of the things we talked about was my use of language, and I had great use of language. However, I constantly was using reminding and redirecting language far more than reinforcing language.
Mm.
And what we know about reinforcing language is that it's going to reinforce the behaviors or responses that we're looking for. So, and I think it's the same for adults. Like, it's not our natural go to language and discourse. But if it was, how much more trust would we build, and how much more of a positive culture would we have that people want to be a part of?
Yeah, yeah. And what's interesting, so I think back to, and oftentimes what leaders tell the people, like their staff, for example, what they're also reinforcing to themselves as leaders. So
Mhm.
if I go into a classroom where it could be just, what you're focusing on at the moment, But if I go into a classroom and I notice that maybe I'm redirecting, I'm not reinforcing, I probably need to work on my own reinforcing. Or if I tell, hey, I noticed that you're not complimenting your students very often. I'm probably not doing that as much myself. I don't know of any research that backs it up.
Yeah.
That's maybe just something that I've analyzed and seen. But
Yeah.
so many times leaders pick out on others what they probably need to do themselves.
Yeah. And what is that phrase? The greatest form of flattery is,
Is imitation?
yeah.
Is that right? Imitation is the greatest form of flattery?
Yeah, there you go. That's what it is. And
Yeah,
wouldn't we want our staff to be, imitating the things that are positive in our interactions with them? So
right.
that kind of reminds me of that.
Absolutely.
Um, there was something else that you said too, and I'm trying to pinpoint exactly what it was. I'm not going to remember. Anyway, yeah, so good and so important. Oh, I know. This reminds me, it kind of makes me think about your friend Emily's situation.
Mm,
And I guarantee she probably, and I'm just speculating and just
mhm.
thinking about my own experience and kind of trying to make it similar to what she probably experienced, but she probably reached a point where she had perfected her craft. She was ready for the next level thing, and she wasn't feeling as though she was as valuable as she once was. And I think that plays a huge role in our burnout or wanting
Mm.
to seek something else, because once you reach a point where you think, I'm really not adding value here anymore, man, you're tapped out.
Yeah, I think what happens too, and I fully agree. I think the more proficient you get at something, the more you start to notice inefficiencies or
Yes.
ways that maybe you would change things. So I think back to what Emily shared with me. She said she devoted so much of her time to her craft, nights and weekends, like so many other teachers. Well, to be at the point where you're special education teacher of the year and you're devoting 10, 12 hours per day on your craft, she's recognizing things that maybe she would do differently or wishes was different. And unless somebody asks you, hey, is there an area you could think of that we could improve this? I notice, these things keep happening. Do you have any ideas for me? That's another reinforcer for the herd part of this. It
Right.
allows her to make some improvements. And maybe it's a teacher leadership type of a role. One of the guests I talked to was, I don't remember her title, but she was at Gwinnett County Public Schools in Georgia, like the ninth or 10th largest district in the US. And she was overseeing teacher retention. And she talked a lot about how they were putting teachers into teacher leadership roles, which were in addition to the work that they were doing. And I said, wait a minute, hold on. So you're giving extra responsibilities to adults, working adults that are already overwhelmed. I said,
Mm,
yeah, and they love it
yeah.
because they have agency, because they have the ability to move things forward how they want. They're empowered to make changes across the district. So yeah, some could see it as additional responsibility. These people were craving this because, to your point, you get to a certain level where, okay, what else can we do? How else
Yeah.
can I again empower, engage, provide more agency to our people? It's not always a bad thing, but you won't know until you ask them.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm loving this conversation. Tell us what else you have for us. What are some other things that you want to bring to the table before we close our time tonight about helping staff feel valued, supported, heard?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that staff can do, let me back up. One of the big things I think that administrators can do to help staff is, if you think about the entire employee experience, which is just a massive topic, you have things like recruiting, you have things like job postings, how am I interacting with future employees, all the way through hopefully retirement. That is a massive thing, a massive continuum to think about. So breaking it down into, here are the most common actions that we do, the most common categories, if you will. I have 7 of those for you. And I won't go into a lot of detail for all of them, but I want to just briefly touch on things that school leaders can think about to make sure the employee experience is a good one. Before I
Yeah.
get to that, though, I want to quickly define the employee experience. Basically, it's what is it like to work here? When you ask yourself that question, what is it like to work here? If you're able to answer that, articulate it, that's what the employee experience is. Again, I suggest that you ask people so that they can talk about it. One of the big things is onboarding. How can you make sure that employees are able to make good connections? You can identify early flight risks through onboarding processes and practices. Having goals are, of course, important. Collaborative goals, surveys. I mentioned that a couple of different times. I think surveys are important combined with one-on-ones. And if I have a big takeaway from this conversation, I think it's stress the importance of one-on-ones because schools don't have them without an
Right.
agenda. There's a post-observation conference, there's a goals conference. You don't normally sit down with staff. I highly recommend one-on-ones. Don't even worry about an agenda. How are you doing? How can I help? What's up? That is an entire one-on-one conversation.
Yep.
Evaluations, another important part. We've a lot of organizations focus on evaluations, PD, and then the other big one is recognition. Again, celebrating one another, sharing the impact that we're making. So those are the 7 components, if you will, of the employee experience that I think every leader needs to really think about and make sure that is well intended, well designed, and has people's input along the way.
Okay, that's awesome. Um, so one of the things that you talked about, just it goes back to the staff feeling heard. One of the things that I mention in a clarity cycle framework that I use with schools to help them build clarity and simplify alignment is listening tours. And
Mm.
we're thinking about like this, what is our instructional focus? Well, we may know as leaders in instructional focus, but we don't know where to start with that instructional focus unless we're gaining insight. And part of gaining insight means that we are interviewing or we are seeking out all kinds of stakeholders to get their unbiased feedback, their vulnerable honesty about this instructional focus or whatever the topic might be. So that's one of the things that you said that made me think about that. And then Andy Stanley, leadership guru, always talks about the fact that what gets celebrated gets repeated. And you've mentioned that so many times in this. So can you tell a little bit about why it might be even more important in a school setting, specifically thinking about your staff to celebrate regularly and what that might look like?
Yeah, I mean, you think about is it Peter Johnson has the books about the amount of feedback given to students, and it's 5 to 1 or 12. I don't remember the exact.
Yeah.
Do you have the numbers in front of you?
I don't have the numbers, but I
Okay.
know, yeah.
Yeah. So I think about school leaders and the number of interactions they have. I think many are neutral to neutral positive with their staff. So I think when you set out with the intention of I'm going to celebrate my people, I think that changes. And if and when you do need to, there are times you have to talk to adults like adults, right? And
Right.
maybe it's a performance issue, maybe it's tardiness or whatever. You have to have those conversations. If you've done those 3 to 5 positives for the one's going to be listened to, the one's going to be receptive. But I think more importantly, you think about the overall society and how society treats educators and talks about education. You might have to be more like 15 or 20 to 1 because the one might come from the news. The one might come from a journal article. It might be an ex formerly Twitter post that somebody has about education. So there's a lot of negative on the outside. Obviously, as a school leader, you can't control all of those things. What you can control is the number of positives that you celebrate within the staff itself.
Yeah.
So I always recommend being very intentional, being very specific. I don't think most leaders have to worry about doing it too much, where you're giving too much praise and too many celebrations, because it's probably not enough anyway.
Right.
How to do that? There are several different ways. There could be the equivalent of a suggestion box in the main office, but it's like a praise box, for example. Some little box, there's a piece of paper beside it with a pencil. People can just write little notes in, and then they submit it. And then the principal might choose 1 or 2. Celebrate those teachers at the end of a week over announcements. So we had 2 teachers this week celebrated. We have these 2. Here are the stories that were shared. I think there's obviously newsletters, there's websites, there's staff meetings, lots of different ways you could do it. The best way of celebrating is to be, again, very specific about a story of impact to get a double whammy, have that story of impact relate back to the core values, to the vision, to the mission of the organization. So most schools have fairly similar missions and visions. Of course, it's going to be about the students. So you can have people tell stories, share stories. Again, the suggestion box is just one example. But try to have even the messaging of it, try to have that nuance to go back to the vision, to the mission, because then you're reinforcing the why behind the organization, which is something that people need reminded of all the time. Why do I exist? Why am I an educator? Why is this important? And then the individual celebration behind the scenes as well. And if you don't have 2, 3, 4 from your staff, just create them yourself and create this flywheel that you generate. Because if you are sharing stories and people don't realize it's just you, others will start to share those stories as well.
I'm reading, or I just actually finished reading a book, and I don't have it right here with me, but it's really a marketing book by Donald Miller, and it's building a story brand. And he talks all about the narrative, basically, that we spin for ourselves and the narrative that we create for our organization. Schools should be no different than that. We should be building a story and a narrative that they can see themselves as a part of. And the problem is, there are all of these other narratives that are being spun for them outside of our organization or even inside our organization if we haven't really worked to adhere to a common vision, mission, or goal. And I think about the narratives that social media spin, like this narrative of teacher overwhelm. Teacher overwhelm does exist. But think about how much more it's emphasized because of the stories that are told in social media. And so it's a hard balance because you're fighting that almost, but it's a good fight to fight.
It is. Yeah, it is. And it's what's interesting too is you mentioned there's all these narratives going on. I think a good story doesn't have to have lots of different narratives. A good story can be thorough, but not everything.
Yeah.
So I think one mistake that school leaders, and I'm certainly guilty of this as well, one mistake is try to do everything at once.
Yes.
So a leader might walk away from this thinking, okay, I've got to do surveys and one-on-ones, and then there's a celebration thing. Let's just make it all happen. I don't recommend that whatsoever. But from a story perspective, capture one really powerful story. Go deep into detail. Again, just like the people I've talked to on my podcast, that I could have a quick conversation with somebody, or I can dig deep for 45 minutes. I dug deep for 45 minutes. Now I have 3 stories that I can share over and over and over again, and include some details here, some details there. I didn't talk to 70 people, 80 people. So don't try to have every story for every situation. Identify something, again, that maybe aligns with your vision, with your mission, with your values. Tell that story over and over. And then observe when a second similar corollary story comes up. Now you have 2 moving towards the same direction, which if you attach stories to that, people start moving in that direction, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Yes, absolutely. I love that so much. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here, and there are actually several questions that we didn't really get to, but there is one that's been burning on my mind, and I want to ask you, how could a leader tell if they've created this culture where the staff does feel heard, supported, and valued? How will they know?
I think it's through observations, and I don't mean go into a classroom with a clipboard and start checking things off. I think a really powerful thing for a school leader to do is just step back for a little bit and see what happens. When you step back, you start realizing there are different connections that people are making with one another or not making with one another. There are certain groups that start to take over, or maybe that don't start to take over. So I think stepping back and then just being very objective and saying, what am I noticing in my staff right now? obviously I'm a huge proponent of sitting down and having conversations with people.
Mm-hmm.
And people's willingness or lack of willingness to talk to you is going to be another major indication. I don't know of any buildings that have a really strong culture where the principal isn't part of that. So
Right.
what happens is there's a strong culture, a large group of people that are moving towards the same direction, typically aligned to the school leader. If you have a lot of people moving in a lot of different directions and not really knowing what to do, when to do it, how to do it, that's going to be a sign of your culture.
Yes.
The other thing that I would recommend is culture by itself is immovable. How do you change culture? Culture is a byproduct of actions, beliefs, attitudes within your school. So you don't change a culture, you change some of the actions, you change some of the beliefs, you change some of the attitudes. As a direct result of that, eventually culture starts to shift a little bit. So don't think about this as this massive blob that I'm looking at. Culture is not just a massive blob. You can break it down and start to observe what's happening, what's not happening. When do you need to get involved? When do teachers need to get involved? When do you need to ask for people's input? Again, I'm always a huge person that says ask for input right away. In this case, I would step back and observe and then, hey, Casey, we have 15 minutes. I'm sitting down with every staff for 15 minutes. I just want to see how it's going. I want to see, how you're doing, make sure you're doing okay. And I think when you step back and give people space, especially space to talk, and just like teachers have long wait times, administrators, it's okay to have long wait times.
Yes.
Don't do it in your office because that's a top-down approach. Go to your teachers' classrooms. Hey, I just want to know how you're doing. How are you? What's going on? And just observing for a while is going to be the best thing. And I think most people will notice, is this the direction that I want to move? Is this not? If it is, what can you reinforce? I wouldn't start thinking about how do I strip away the 10% that's not working well. I would say focus on the 90%.
Yep.
If it's not going well, what does the staff think needs to change? Not necessarily you, because you've been leading this already, getting to the result where you are right now. But as a staff, what do we feel like we need to improve? What are some areas for us to continue to move forward?
Yeah, I love that. So much of what you've talked about is exactly the clarity cycle framework of we're going to look at what are our needs, what are our strengths, how can we identify goals, how can we gain insight, and then how are we going to cast a vision for our goals and our focus. And then I don't know if you have, and I don't want to add to the list of things that people might take away, like, oh, I've got to do this, this, and this, kind of to your point. But I think it's also cool to do vision tours where you are walking your campus and you're having the conversations, but you are taking a step back and viewing it through the lens of your campus or district vision or the instructional focus goals that you've set for the year, and really thinking, what do I notice about what's happening in conversations, in body language, in actual conversations between adults and students and what's happening in the classrooms? What am I noticing that either points to the vision or doesn't point to the vision that we've cast?
Yep.
And then there was one last thing that you mentioned. It's kind of left my brain, but there was so much in that. Oh, I know what it was. So much of what you've talked about tonight. And I'm going to ask you this question, but I'm going to kind of answer this question as though I'm asking myself, because
Sure.
usually I ask my guests, what is one thing that you want listeners to take away? And I'm going to answer it for myself. What I hope all of you take away from tonight's conversation, and Eric, I'm going to let you jump in here in a second, is the importance of just listening. And listening is a true art. You have to practice it and develop listening skills. And it sounds like the easiest thing, right? I'm just going to listen. But we have so many habits as adults when we're quote unquote listening to people that we sometimes don't recognize.
Yep.
So I would really highly encourage you guys to take a step back and view yourself from the balcony and think about what you notice about yourself as a listener. So with that said, Eric, what do you hope that our listeners will take away from this episode?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think the listeners here need to be listeners. And I think I'll take that a step further. One thing I haven't talked at all about is being curious as well. So listening, and I'll use some sales language or some sales, kind of metaphors here. When you're talking with a prospect, somebody who may be interested in your product or service, they're going to say something. They're going to say, "This is the problem." That's almost never the problem. That's a symptom that they're experiencing. There's a problem beneath that. How do you get beneath what they say is the problem? Well, it's simple. You're curious. "Oh, tell me more. Interesting. Let me paraphrase this, make sure I fully understand that." So I think listening, absolutely taking that to the next level, is being curious and asking just a couple of follow-up questions just to make sure that you're giving, again, space for the person to talk, give them time to fully answer, don't interject. And oftentimes what happens is school leaders, and this happens to teachers a lot too. You're in a classroom as a teacher, you're the expert, you're the one that has all the answers. You're a school leader now. You're the expert. You're the one that's seen as having all the answers. It's okay to not have all the answers all the time. It's okay to ask questions and to just wait, because that's when people have space to talk. They start elaborating, they start expanding on what they have to say, and then interject with "Oh, tell me more about that. You said such and such. Tell me more." Because what ends up happening is the real truth is eventually what's vocalized when before it was just a symptom.
Yeah. So my friend Michelle Rui is here tonight. And Michelle, I know you were hearing so much of Michael Bungay Stanier's questions coming out here. He has the book, the Stay Curious, Be Humble, Stay Curious, and Change the Way You Lead Forever, or
Mm,
something to that effect. And he starts with, what's on your mind? And what else? Tell me more about that. And it's just question after question, and getting to the real challenge, because that first challenge is not always the
yep.
real challenge.
And don't just ask the questions for the sake of asking the questions. Ask the questions because you're curious about what else
Yes.
is behind the scenes.
Yep. And then listen to understand instead of listening to respond.
Yes.
Okay. This has been a fantastic conversation, Eric. How can our guests get in touch with you or find you out in the world of social media and
Yeah,
networking?
the best way is probably LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit, not as often as I hope to. Life just has a way of getting in the way at times. But feel free to search for Eric Bransteter, ERIC, last name Bransteter, Bransteter. Feel free to connect with me. Would love to make connections with your audience.
Yeah, awesome. And guys, all of everything that you need to know about Eric will be in the show notes on I will post it on YouTube, the LinkedIn show, and then it will be on the podcast, which is on Spotify and iTunes. So be sure to share this with your people who need to hear these messages. And if you are listening to this live or you're catching the replay, we want to hear from you. Share in the comments what was most useful for you here today. And until next time, just catch up with us. Catch up with us on social media. Catch up with us on, Eric, you have your podcast, right? Tell us again what the podcast is.
Yeah, it's called the Employee Experience and Education Podcast.
Perfect. Okay, guys. Well, we'll catch you later. Bye,
Thanks,
Eric.
Casey.
Hey, guys, I want to give a huge shout out to you for tuning into today's Change Catalyst conversation. I would love for you to do me two solid favors. Number one, if you have enjoyed this or any other Change Catalyst conversation, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I've got a lot of great content and guests coming up, and I don't want you to miss any of it. Number two, if you are thinking of a friend or colleague who could benefit from this show, share it with them. The only way to make change happen is through a multiplier effect. And you can be a multiplier by sharing this show. Until next time, I want you to go off and do the great things that Change Catalysts do.